The autumn air was crisp, and the scent of pine filled the mountain retreat. For Emily and Daniel, this anniversary trip was long overdue. Married for 6 years, they had been swept away by the demands of work, family, and life. This trip to a quaint cabin tucked away in the Blue Ridge Mountains was supposed to be a chance to reconnect. Emily fell in love with the listing the moment she saw it. The photos showed a charming log cabin with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed a breathtaking view of the valley below. Inside, there was a stone fireplace, a fully stocked kitchen, and cozy, rustic furnishings. But what sold Emily was the host's promise of complete privacy after all. It was just the two of them. They arrived on a Friday evening, greeted by a golden sunset spilling over the treetops. The cabin was just as advertised, perhaps even better. Daniel carried their bags inside while Emily explored. The living room had a warm, inviting feel, with soft throw blankets draped over the couch and shelves filled with old books. The kitchen smelled faintly of cedar and lemons, as though someone had recently cleaned it. A perfect start to a perfect weekend. But as Emily wandered down the hallway, something caught her eye. At the far end was a heavy wooden door, oddly mismatched compared to the other lighter, modern doors in the house. Its surface was scratched, the paint faded, and a large padlock secured it tightly. "Hey, Dan," Emily called. "What's with this door?" Daniel joined her, squinting at the oddity. That's weird. Maybe it's a maintenance closet or something." Emily frowned. "But why lock it like this? And why didn't the host mention it?" They debated briefly, with Daniel brushing it off as unimportant. "It's probably just storage. Let's not worry about it." Emily tried to let it go, but as they settled in that evening, her curiosity lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that something about the door didn't sit right. The padlock seemed unnecessary for a mere storage room, and its battered appearance clashed with the rest of the meticulously maintained cabin. As the night deepened, Emily and Daniel curled up by the fire, sipping wine and reminiscing. They laughed, relaxed, and finally began to feel the stress of daily life melt away. But as the flames flickered, casting shadows that danced across the walls, Emily thought she heard something, a faint scratching noise, like nails against wood. She paused, her wine glass hovering midair. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Daniel, half asleep, shook his head. Hear what Emily listened intently, but the sound didn't repeat. Shaking it off, she convinced herself it was just her imagination. After all, they were in the middle of the woods. There were bound to be animals nearby. But as they climbed into bed, the image of that locked door lingered in her mind. The next morning was bright and serene. Birds chirped outside the window, and the smell of coffee filled the air as Daniel brewed their morning pot. Emily, still fixated on the door, decided to text the host under the guise of curiosity. "Hi, loving the cabin so far. Just a quick question, what's behind the locked door at the end of the hall?" The response came quicker than she expected. "Oh, that's just a storage room for some old furniture and supplies. Nothing to worry about. Hope you're enjoying your stay." The message was friendly enough, but Emily noticed something. The host didn't actually answer why it was locked so securely. "See? Nothing to worry about," Daniel said when she shared the reply. He pulled her outside to enjoy breakfast on the porch, and for a while she managed to forget her unease. They spent the day hiking, taking photos, and marveling at the vibrant autumn leaves. By the time they returned to the cabin, they were exhausted but happy. That night, however, the scratching returned, louder this time, persistent. Emily bolted upright, her heart pounding. She glanced at Daniel, who was snoring softly beside her. The noise seemed to echo through the hallway, originating from the locked door. Gathering her courage, she crept out of bed and tiptoed toward the sound. The cabin was eerily quiet, save for the faint creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. She reached the door and pressed her ear against it. For a moment there was silence, then scritch, 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 scritch. Emily gasped, stumbling back. She raced back to bed and shook Daniel awake. "Dan, there's something behind the door." Half asleep and irritated, Daniel groaned. "Em, it's probably a raccoon or something." Go back to bed, but Emily couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling a gnawing sense of dread. By their third day, the atmosphere had shifted. What once felt like a cozy retreat now seemed oppressive. Emily's nerves were frayed, and even Daniel admitted the scratching noises were strange. That evening, as they sat by the fire, the power suddenly went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. "Great," Daniel muttered, grabbing a flashlight. "Must be the wind." Emily clung to him as they fumbled through the house, lighting candles. When they reached the hallway, her stomach dropped. The locked door was ajar. Daniel took the lead, holding the flashlight steady as Emily clung to his arm. The sight of the partially open door sent chills down her spine. The padlock lay on the floor, its latch unhinged, and the door creaked softly, as though it had been nudged open recently. "Maybe the wind blew it open," Daniel offered, though his voice wavered slightly. Emily shook her head. "The padlock, Dan. Wind doesn't unlock padlocks." Cautiously, they approached the door. Daniel pushed it open with the flashlight, revealing a dark and narrow space. The room smelled of damp wood and something else, something metallic, like rust. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the beam of light swept across the room. The walls were covered in faint scratches, as though something had clawed at them repeatedly. In the corner of the room sat an old, rotting chair with its upholstery shredded. The floor was littered with fragments of wood and what appeared to be tufts of fur. But what unnerved Emily most was the peculiar set of marks leading from the corner to the doorway, as though something had been dragged out. Daniel shined the flashlight deeper into the room, revealing more unsettling details. The scratches on the walls weren't random, they formed strange, overlapping patterns, almost as though someone or something had been desperately trying to carve a message into the wood. Emily's stomach churned as she noticed the crude drawings etched between the scratches stick figures with gaping mouths and wide, hollow eyes. "What the hell is this?" Daniel whispered, his voice shaky. Emily couldn't answer. Her gaze fell to the floor, where a faint trail of red stains too dark and dried to be fresh led back out of the room. It wasn't just rust she'd smelled earlier, it was blood. A sudden gust of icy air swept through the hallway, extinguishing one of the candles they'd placed on the floor. The flame flickered violently before vanishing, plunging them deeper into shadow. Emily grabbed Daniel's arm, her breath hitching. "Did you feel that?" she stammered. Daniel nodded, scanning the room with the flashlight. "It's just a draft." The windows probably before he could finish. A loud, guttural groan echoed from somewhere deep within the house. It was a sound unlike anything they'd ever heard, a chilling mix of human agony and animalistic growling. The flashlight flickered in Daniel's trembling hand as both of them froze. "That didn't come from outside," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. They stepped back into the hallway, Daniel pulling the door shut behind them. "We're leaving," he said firmly. But just as they turned to head for the living room, the groaning sound came again, this time louder, closer, and accompanied by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps above them. "The attic," Emily said, her voice cracking. "Let's just go," Daniel urged, pulling her toward the front door. The footsteps quickened, echoing across the ceiling as though something massive was pacing directly above their heads. Just as they reached the door, a deafening crash sounded from upstairs. Emily screamed as the ceiling above the hallway groaned and cracked, dust and splinters raining down around them. "Run," Daniel shouted. They bolted outside into the cold night air, leaving the cabin behind. Emily glanced back just once and saw the faint outline of a figure standing at the attic window, a tall, shadowy silhouette with glowing eyes. Emily and Daniel didn't stop running until they were well into the woods, the cabin barely visible behind the dense thicket of trees. Both were gasping for air, their breaths forming small clouds in the frigid night. What was that?" Emily managed to say between deep gulps of air. Daniel shook his head, his flashlight flickering in his trembling hand. "I don't know. But we're not staying to find out." The eerie silence of the forest was suddenly punctuated by the sound of snapping twigs. It wasn't coming from the cabin. It was coming from behind them. "Keep moving," Daniel urged, grabbing Emily's hand. They stumbled through the darkness, guided only by the weak beam of the flashlight and the pale light of the moon. The once beautiful forest now felt like a labyrinth of shadows, the tall trees pressing in on them from all sides. Every step they took was accompanied by the growing sense that they weren't alone. Then they heard a low, guttural growl, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing. Emily froze, her grip tightening on Daniel's arm. Slowly they turned toward the source of the noise. At first they saw nothing, but as the flashlight's beam swept over the trees, they caught a glimpse of it, a tall, gaunt figure standing just beyond the reach of the light. Its eyes glowed an unnatural yellow, and its head tilted unnaturally to one side, as if studying them. "Run," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. Before Emily could respond, the figure took a step closer, its movements jerky and inhuman. Panic surged through her, and they bolted once again, their footsteps echoing loudly in the still night. They finally broke through the tree line and onto a gravel road. Emily recognized it as the path leading to the cabin's driveway. Relief flooded her as she spotted their car parked ahead. "Get in," Daniel shouted, fumbling with the keys as they reached the vehicle. Emily threw herself into the passenger seat, locking the doors as Daniel started the engine. The car roared to life, and Daniel floored the accelerator, sending gravel flying as they sped down the narrow road. As they drove, Emily glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure chasing them. Instead, the road behind them was empty, shrouded in darkness. But just as she began to relax, something caught her eye. Daniel. "The back seat," she whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel didn't need to look. The icy tone in her voice was enough. He slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. The momentum sent Emily lurching forward, but she didn't dare turn around. Slowly, Daniel reached for the flashlight on the dashboard, his movements deliberate. With a shaking hand, he turned it on and pointed it over his shoulder. The back seat was empty. Emily exhaled a shaky breath, her pulse still racing. "I thought I saw." A loud bang cut her off, reverberating through the car as though something had struck it from the outside. They both screamed as the windshield cracked, a spiderweb pattern spreading rapidly across the glass. "Go, Daniel, go." Emily cried. Daniel didn't need to be told twice. He hit the gas, the car lurching forward as they sped down the road. The cracks in the windshield made it difficult to see, but Daniel kept his focus, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The banging continued, echoing from the roof of the car now. Whatever it wasn't letting them leave without a fight. Finally, they saw the glow of headlights in the distance. Another car was approaching from the opposite direction. As the two vehicles drew closer, the banging stopped. Emily and Daniel waved frantically, pulling over to flag down the other driver. A middle-aged man in a pickup truck rolled down his window, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. "You folks okay?" he asked. "We need help," Daniel said, his voice cracking. "There's someone, chasing us." The man nodded slowly, glancing back toward the direction they'd come from. "Hop in my truck. I'll take you to the nearest police station." Daniel hesitated for only a moment before nodding. They abandoned their car and climbed into the truck, the warmth of the heater a stark contrast to the icy grip of fear still clutching their hearts. As the truck rumbled down the road, Emily looked back one last time. The forest loomed in the distance, dark and foreboding. She thought she saw something moving among the trees, but she couldn't be sure. As the truck rumbled down the road, the familiar, quiet hum of the engine did little to soothe Emily's nerves. She pressed her hands against the sides of her face, trying to calm herself, but her thoughts kept returning to the figure in the woods, those glowing yellow eyes. The unsettling growl, the way it had moved. Daniel's knuckles were still white on the seat, his eyes darting nervously to the rearview mirror, as if he expected the creature to be right behind them. "I don't know what we're running from," Daniel said, his voice low. "But I know it's not over." Emily looked at him, her breath catching. "What do you mean?" "We're leaving. We're safe. We have to be." "I thought the same thing when we saw the headlights. But when that guy stopped and helped us, did you notice something strange about him?" Daniel's voice quivered, his eyes. They were just like the thing in the woods. Emily's heart raced. She wanted to dismiss it, but deep down she knew Daniel wasn't imagining things. The man's eyes had been unsettling, too wide, too knowing. The truck's tires hummed steadily as it continued down the road, but Emily felt the weight of every passing second. The distance between them and the cabin was growing, but the further they got, the more the oppressive feeling of being watched began to settle over her. The forest, which had seemed so distant, now felt like it was closing in on them. Then the sudden sharp turn ahead startled them both. The truck veered slightly as the man quickly swerved to the side. "We'll be passing an old service station up ahead," the man said, glancing over his shoulder briefly. "I'll stop there." Emily wanted to speak up, to ask why they were stopping when they should be getting as far away from the woods as possible. But before she could, the truck skidded to a halt. "It wasn't at the station." "What are you?" Daniel began, but his words died in his throat. The man's head turned slowly, his eyes glowing an unnatural yellow in the truck's dim light. A low, guttural growl rumbled from deep within his chest. "Get out," the man rasped, his voice cold and inhuman. Before they could react, the truck doors suddenly slammed shut, locking from the inside. The windows fogged up as the air in the cab grew thick with a strange, foul stench. Emily's pulse quickened as the truck's engine sputtered and died. "Daniel," Emily whispered, clutching his arm. In the silence, a distant rustling came from the forest. The figure, the growling, it was all coming back. Then, through the growing darkness, the outline of a tall, gaunt figure began to emerge from the trees ahead. The same glowing yellow eyes, the same eerie, unnatural movements. Daniel's voice broke the tension, but it was filled with terror. "We're not getting out of here alive. Are we?" The creature's jerky movements quickened as it neared, its head snapping side to side, scanning. The truck's doors began to rattle as if something was trying to get in. Suddenly, Emily heard a voice, not the man's, but a cold, shrill whisper that seemed to come from every direction. "The watchers are always watching. There's no escape." A violent thud shook the truck, and the windshield shattered, but not a single piece of glass fell. The figure outside didn't move closer, it simply stood there, watching. Emily screamed as the figure's eyes locked on hers, its face now visible, pale, hollow, twisted in a grotesque smile. She realized with growing horror that it wasn't the man, but something far worse. The man's voice, once cold, now echoed with an unnatural, garbled tone. "We never let you leave." The truck jerked as the creature's presence grew stronger, and just before it overwhelmed them, a blinding light burst from the horizon, lighting up the entire forest in a stark, white flash. This cliffhanger leaves the audience in suspense, with Emily and Daniel still trapped, facing an uncertain fate. You can expand further on the aftermath or reveal the mystery in a future story or video, playing with the tension that something far worse awaits, even after escaping the initial threat. Does this fit the direction you want for the conclusion of the story? The wind howled through the trees, barely audible over the steady patter of rain against the car windows. Emily had been driving for hours, seeking peace and quiet far from the chaos of city life. The reviews of a secluded cottage on the edge of a forest promised the perfect escape. The place was described as a charming, rustic retreat, surrounded by towering pines and a small stream, exactly what she needed after weeks of stressful work. As she pulled up to the gravel driveway, the silence was the first thing that struck her. The cottage, with its weathered stone walls and creeping ivy, stood surrounded by thick trees. A faint sense of unease crept over her, but she shook it off. The place was supposed to be a dream. When she reached the door, she noticed it was slightly ajar, just enough to suggest someone had been there recently. She brushed off the oddity, thinking it was just an oversight. But as she stepped inside, an unsettling scent of old wood and something faintly metallic filled the air. She couldn't quite place it, but it made her uneasy. The interior was charming, with wooden floors that creaked under her feet and simple vintage furniture. A fireplace crackled, casting flickering shadows. But as she admired the space, she heard a door creak open behind her. Turning around, she was met by a tall man with dark hair, his smile warm yet strangely intense. "You must be Emily," he said, his voice deep and smooth. "I'm Adam. I hope the trip wasn't too difficult." Emily offered a weak smile. It was fine, just a bit long. "This place is beautiful," Adam nodded, his gaze lingering on her a moment too long. He handed her an old-fashioned brass key and stepped closer than she felt comfortable with. "You'll find everything you need here. The Wisconsin Fi password is on the fridge, and I've left a list of local attractions if you want to explore. If you need anything, don't hesitate to call." His words were pleasant, but there was an odd weight to them, as though he were inspecting her rather than welcoming her. Her gut twisted, but she attributed it to the long drive. He finally stepped back, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well, enjoy your stay." As Adam turned to leave, Emily closed the door behind him, still feeling unsettled. She tried to shake off the feeling, focusing on the peaceful surroundings and the rain drumming against the roof. But as she unpacked, the strange sensation that something wasn't right grew stronger. The air in the cottage felt heavy, thick with unspoken words. A sudden knock at the door startled her, and when she opened it, Adam stood there again, too close for comfort. "Just wanted to make sure everything's to your liking," he said, his smile lingering unnaturally. Emily forced a smile, replying, "It's fine, really. Everything's perfect well. I'm just across the way if you need anything," he said before walking away into the rain, leaving her with a lingering feeling that she was being watched. The night fell quickly, and Emily settled in front of the fire, trying to relax after her long drive. The wind outside picked up, rustling the trees in the forest, their branches scraping together with an eerie, whispering sound. She told herself it was just the wind, but tonight felt different. A heavy stillness hung in the air, as though the house itself were waiting for something. To distract herself, Emily explored the cottage. The kitchen was small but well-stocked, and the wooden floors creaked under her feet as she wandered. Despite the peaceful surroundings, her thoughts kept returning to Adam the way he had seemed too interested in her. His smile too perfect, his voice too rehearsed. She tried to ignore it. This place was supposed to be a retreat. When she passed by the back door, she noticed it was slightly ajar, just an inch or two. She hadn't left it open. Hesitating, she reached for the handle, but then stopped, hearing a faint shuffle of footsteps just outside. She froze, listening intently. There was nothing but the rain and the occasional creak of the house. No one was there, but her heart raced with the feeling of being watched. Trying to calm herself, Emily shut the door, telling herself it was nothing. She was alone, and it was just the wind playing tricks on her. But as she turned toward the kitchen, her phone buzzed with a message from Adam. "Hey, Emily, I hope you're settling in okay. Just checking to make sure you're comfortable. Let me know if you need anything." The timing of the message felt off. He seemed to know exactly where she had been, even though she hadn't told him about the back door. She dismissed it, but unease crept over her. She made some tea, hoping it would settle her nerves, but the storm outside grew fiercer, slamming against the windows with increasing force. When the kettle whistled, Emily jumped. She poured the hot water into a mug, her hands trembling slightly, and returned to the living room. But when she entered, her eyes immediately went to the front door. It was slightly ajar. She was certain she had closed it. Her heart skipped a beat. She couldn't have left it open. A panic surged within her, and her hand instinctively reached for her phone. But before she could text Adam, another message popped up. "I noticed the back door was unlocked when I checked in earlier. Just wanted to make sure everything's okay. Let me know if you need anything else." Adam, her blood ran cold. She hadn't told him about the back door. There was no way he could have known. With shaking hands, Emily slammed the door shut, her breath shallow as the fear tightened in her chest. Something wasn't right, and she was no longer sure she was alone. Despite the exhaustion weighing on her, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even as she tried to sleep, her mind raced, replaying the odd messages from Adam. Why would he know about the unlocked door? The unease tightened around her, and every gust of wind outside seemed to whisper her name. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and she drifted into a restless sleep. But at 2 a.m., she was jolted awake by soft footsteps. They circled the cottage slowly, methodically. Emily sat up, listening, her heart pounding. The footsteps stopped, and silence filled the house. Then a knock came at her bedroom door. Emily froze, too afraid to move, but the door creaked open. In the dim light, she saw a tall, thin figure standing in the doorway. The air felt colder, and Emily's heart raced. She reached for her phone, fumbling as she turned on the flashlight. It was Adam. But something was horribly wrong. His face was blank, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring through her as though he didn't even see the light. In his hands, he held a tray of food, smiling eerily, as though everything was perfectly normal. "Just checking on you," he said, his voice too calm, too rehearsed. Fear flooded through her. "Why are you in here?" she whispered, but Adam didn't respond. He just stood there, waiting. Emily wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, she managed to choke out, leave Adam's smile never wavered. Without a word, he slowly backed away, leaving the room with the tray still in his hands. The door clicked shut behind him, but Emily could still feel his presence lingering, as though he never truly left. Her heart raced as the silence pressed in on her. She knew she had to leave, but the storm outside raged on, and the fear of Adam or whatever he was lingered in the darkness. She forced herself to get up, locking the door once more, though she knew it wouldn't help. Peering out the window, Emily's breath fogged up the glass. Through the rain-soaked blur, she saw a figure standing near the porch, still, watching. Was it Adam or something else? Her pulse spiked, and the figure remained motionless, waiting for her every move. The night dragged on. Emily couldn't relax. Every creak, every gust of wind felt like an omen. She hadn't slept in hours, but she couldn't close her eyes. Every time she tried, the image of Adam's cold, empty stare would invade her thoughts, followed by the sound of his slow, deliberate footsteps. It had only been a few hours since Adam had left, but the isolation of the cottage, the storm, and the eerie quiet surrounding it only heightened her sense of dread. Was he still there? Was he still there? Was he lurking, watching her from the shadows? Around 3 a.m., the sound came again, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like footsteps in the hall outside her room. Emily's pulse quickened. She grabbed her phone, but it felt out of reach. The footsteps circled, getting closer. Panicked, she texted Rachel, "Something's wrong." "Adam's acting strange. I don't feel safe. Please call me." The reply buzzed immediately. "You're just stressed. Stay calm. Lock the doors and sleep. You're safe." Safe? The word felt absurd. She was anything but safe. Then came the knock, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. Her heart raced in her chest. Was it Adam? Was something worse? Her thoughts raced. But she couldn't call the police. The signal was terrible. How long would it take for help to reach her? She had no time. The knocking continued, followed by a low murmur. Unmistakably human. "Emily, I just want to check on you." Footsteps again, circling, closing in like a predator on its prey. Desperate, Emily grabbed the flashlight and pointed it at the door. She saw the faint shadow of his form beneath the doorframe. No more waiting. She couldn't stay locked in her room with him outside. She bolted for the window, but it was stuck. Her hands trembled as she fought to pry it open. The rain was still pouring, but she didn't care. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, the window opened with a squeak. She didn't hesitate. She climbed out into the storm, her feet slipping on the muddy ground. The cold rain soaked her, but she ran as if her life depended on it. Behind her, footsteps followed, heavy, deliberate. Her mind screamed at her to keep running, but the sound grew closer until she felt a hand grip her shoulder. Her heart stopped. She whirled around, flashlight in hand, only to find nothing. The woods were empty, the rain blurring her vision. Maybe she was imagining things. But then she felt it again, the cold, creeping sensation of being watched. She turned quickly, shining the flashlight wildly through the trees. And there he was, Adam. His pale face glowed faintly in the dark, his eyes locked on her from the edge of the woods, unblinking, unmoving. She could hear nothing but the pounding rain, but his presence made the air thick with dread. Her blood ran cold. Without thinking, she turned and ran again, pushing herself harder through the woods, stumbling and slipping. She couldn't stop. She couldn't let him catch her. Ahead, through the trees, she saw headlights bright, steady, and growing closer. She ran toward them, desperate for help. Finally, she reached the dirt road and waved frantically. The car screeched to a halt in front of her. The door flew open. "Get in," a voice shouted. Without a second thought, Emily scrambled inside. The car door slammed shut, the engine roared to life, and the car sped away, leaving the cottage and Adam behind. The storm raged on outside, but inside the car, Emily collapsed, gasping for breath. Relief flooded through her, mingled with the terror that Adam was still out there, waiting. The car sped down the darkened road, headlights casting fleeting shadows across the wet pavement. Emily sat rigid in the passenger seat, her eyes glued to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Adam's face staring back at her. Her chest was tight, every heartbeat a drum of impending doom. "Are you okay?" the driver asked. His voice was calm, but concern lined his features. He was an older man, maybe in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair. He had stopped when he found her standing in the road, drenched and trembling. Now he was driving her to the nearest town without hesitation. Emily struggled to answer, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. I don't know what happened. There was someone there. Someone who wasn't supposed to be." The driver's gaze flickered briefly to her. "You mean the host?" Emily's heart skipped a beat. "You know him?" The driver nodded grimly, his grip tightening on the wheel. "His name's Adam. He's been around for years. We don't get many travelers, but every time someone stays at that cottage, something happens. The locals talk about him, but nobody dares to say too much. You're lucky you got out." The words hit Emily like a brick. She had thought she was losing her mind, but hearing this, it all made sense. The host wasn't just eccentric, he was dangerous. And she wasn't the first to sense it. Why didn't anyone warn me? She demanded, her voice shaking with anger. Why didn't anyone tell me about him? The driver's face darkened. People have tried, but his reputation. It's hard to explain. Most folks just try to forget. They'd rather not get involved. That's how it always goes. Emily turned away from him, staring out the window as the rain began to let up. The storm subsided, but a sense of unease lingered. She could still feel the isolation of the cottage pressing in on her. The feeling of being trapped in that house with Adam, his quiet, unsettling presence. She had escaped, but had she truly gotten away? As the car approached a small town, Emily felt a fleeting sense of relief. The distant glow of streetlights flickered in the darkness, offering a semblance of safety. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that Adam's grip still held her. It wasn't just the storm or the shadows in the woods. It was the haunting presence of someone who wasn't supposed to be there, and whose influence lingered long after they were gone. "Where do you need to go?" the driver asked, breaking the silence. Emily paused, uncertain. I don't know. I just need to get as far away as possible. There's a motel up ahead," the driver suggested. "You can stay there for the night. They're decent folks. You'll be safe." She nodded absently, too tired to argue. She stepped out of the car, her legs unsteady, and thanked him with a weak smile. "Be careful," he warned, before pulling away into the night. Standing before the motel room, Emily hesitated. She didn't want to go in, but she had no choice. She needed rest, even if she felt like she could never truly escape the nightmare. As she stepped inside, something felt wrong. The faintest sound of footsteps, light and deliberate, echoed from the hallway outside. Her heart raced, her breath caught in her throat. She backed away from the door, hand hovering over the handle, ready to flee. But before she could move, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Just checking on you." The words were simple, innocent, but they sent a chill through her. They were Adam's words. The realization hit her like a wave. She was never alone. Adam's presence had never left her. The phone buzzed again. "I'm always here." Waiting panic surged within her as she rushed to the window, eyes scanning the parking lot. Nothing. Just the flickering streetlights, the empty shadows stretching out. Her hands trembled as she gripped the door handle, torn between leaving and staying. She knew deep down that running wouldn't matter. Adam was still out there, and he wasn't going anywhere. As the sun dipped below the horizon, 5 friends in their late 20s arrived at the luxurious villa they rented for the weekend. Located at the edge of a forest, the modern villa was a perfect escape, offering sweeping views of nature and sleek, minimalist interiors. However, the moment they stepped inside, a sense of unease settled in. In the dining room, an antique mirror dominated the space, its dark glass reflecting the room in an unsettling way. The ornate frame, out of place among the modern decor, gave off a strange energy. Emily felt watched, but couldn't explain why. "I don't know, that mirror gives me the creeps," Jamie remarked. "It's probably just an old heirloom Luke dismissed, trying to ease the tension." But Emily couldn't shake the feeling. Later, as the group settled in and enjoyed drinks, Jamie walked past the mirror and froze, her face going pale. "Did you see that?" she whispered, pointing to the reflection. There was no one behind her, just distorted reflections. "Maybe it's just your eyes playing tricks," Luke suggested, brushing it off. But Jamie couldn't ignore the feeling. After a few awkward moments, she excused herself to bed, leaving the others uneasy. Emily, still uneasy, couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was watching them. That night, as she lay in bed, Emily heard faint whispers. When she looked toward the dining room, there was nothing. The last thing she heard before falling asleep was the faintest echo of someone whispering her name. The next morning, the villa seemed peaceful again. The sun's light filtered through the windows as the group enjoyed breakfast, but the unease Emily felt lingered. She tried to dismiss it, but the antique mirror in the dining room kept drawing her attention. Its reflection felt too perfect, unnaturally so. Emily noticed something else unsettling. The back door was slightly ajar. She figured one of the others had left it open, but a shiver ran down her spine. Later, as they explored the grounds, she pushed the thought aside, but the feeling of being watched never fully left her. When they returned, the back door was open again. Emily knew she had locked it before. She felt a growing unease but said nothing, rationalizing it. But when she stepped outside to close it, she saw no footprints or signs of anyone. Yet the door felt wrong, like it was being deliberately opened. That night, as the group relaxed, Emily felt a drop in temperature, and the house seemed quieter. Then, as they talked, she felt another chill as the back door opened once more. This time, the others noticed. "What's going on with that door?" Jamie asked. "I locked it," Emily replied, uneasily. Luke closed it again, dismissing it, but Emily knew something wasn't right. The door wasn't a simple mistake, it felt deliberate. That night, while trying to sleep, Emily's gaze fell on the mirror again. The shadows seemed to shift, and she heard faint whispers. Her breath caught as she strained to listen, the whisper growing clearer, "Come closer." The mirror shimmered as though something within it was alive, waiting. Emily tried to ignore it, but the unease never left. She lay awake, wondering, was the mirror just glass, or was something inside it, waiting to escape? The next few days in the villa were unsettling. Emily tried to convince herself it was all in her head, but the feeling of dread grew stronger with each passing moment. Her friends, too, seemed off. Laughs were forced, conversations quieter. The mirror, once a harmless curiosity, now felt ominous. At first it was just strange reflections of flicker, a shadow out of place. But soon the disturbances escalated. On the second day, Emily stood in front of the mirror, staring into its depths. The reflection didn't match the ruined furniture, was displaced, shadows unnaturally dark. But what truly chilled her was the figure she saw standing behind her in the reflection, obscured in shadow. She spun around, but no one was there. "Did you see that?" Emily whispered to her friends, but when they looked, there was nothing. They chalked it up to the light. Emily felt foolish, yet the unease persisted. That evening, as they played cards by the fireplace, Jamie remarked, "I swear I saw something in the mirror. Like someone was standing behind me." Emily froze. Jamie looked around, but nothing was amiss. Luke suggested it was just the light. Emily, however, felt certain that something was wrong. On the third day, the group went for a hike, but as soon as Emily returned, she felt the same chill in the air. That night, unable to sleep, she slipped out of bed and approached the mirror. She touched the cold glass, and for a moment, nothing happened. But then, out of the corner of her eye, a figure appeared in the reflection, its features obscured. Emily gasped and turned around. The room was empty, but the figure remained. It wasn't a shadow, it was a person watching her. Slowly, the figure raised a hand and waved, cold, deliberate. Emily whispered, "Get away from the mirror," as terror gripped her. The figure stepped forward, closing the gap between them. In a panic, Emily bolted from the room, her heart racing. She collapsed in the living room, shaking. She knew now it wasn't just the house that was haunted. The mirror was holding something trapped inside, something trying to break free. The power had gone out hours ago, leaving the group in near total darkness. Only the flickering candles casting eerie shadows on the walls. Every noise, every creak of the house, every gust of wind seemed amplified, and the mirror, cold and still, drew Emily's gaze like a magnet. She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was coming. After hours of tense silence, the group reluctantly turned in. But sleep eluded Emily. She lay wide awake, thoughts consumed by the mirror, its distorted reflections, and the shadowy figure that had appeared. Just as she was beginning to doze off, she heard the soft creak of the bedroom door. Footsteps echoed in the dark, and Emily froze, her heart pounding. When the footsteps stopped, she felt compelled to check the mirror. Her hands trembling, she turned on her phone's flashlight and gasped at what she saw. The reflection was wrong. The walls, the furniture, everything was slightly different, as if it belonged to another version of the room. And in the corner of the dining room, the figure stood tall, shadowy, and unmoving. It raised a hand, and like before, it waved at her. Panic surged through her veins as she turned to leave, but her reflection didn't follow. It stayed frozen while the figure inched closer with every step she took. Emily screamed and ran for the door, but just as she grabbed the handle, the room went completely black. Then came the sound, sharp, like glass shattering. The mirror had cracked. The figure didn't stay in the shattered reflection. It had crossed over. A blood-curdling scream filled the air, and Emily bolted the door, her heart racing. She stumbled into the night, her friends rushing to her side, but she couldn't explain. She just pointed to the shattered mirror, her face pale and terrified. Without a word, they grabbed their things and fled into the night. As they drove away, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror wasn't finished with them, that whatever had been trapped inside had followed them out. The car sped down the winding road, headlights cutting through the thick forest, as the villa faded behind them, swallowed by the night. Emily could still feel the terror in her bones, the weight of the figure in the mirror, following her every movement. Her friends sat silently, their fear as visible as her own. They drove in heavy silence, lost in thoughts too haunting to speak. Breaking the stillness, Emily whispered, "We need to tell someone. We need to report what happened." Jason, sitting in the back, hesitated. Who would believe us? How do you explain? That she knew he was right. The events were too unbelievable, too bizarre for anyone to take seriously. But Emily couldn't shake the image of the mirror, the way the figure had watched her with cold, calculating eyes. Whatever it wasn't finished with them. When they reached the nearest town, they stopped at a small gas station. The first light of dawn touched the sky, but Emily could still feel the darkness of the villa clinging to her. Exhaustion weighed them all down, but it was clear that none of them could rest. "We should call the host," Emily suggested. "Maybe they know something about it." About the mirror, Jason and Sarah agreed. They couldn't go back to the villa, but the need to understand what had happened pushed them forward. After a tense phone call, the host confirmed the mirror had been there for decades, an antique passed down through generations. When Emily mentioned the figure, the host's voice faltered. "The mirror is said to have once belonged to a wealthy family. There are rumors. They disappeared one by one. People say the mirror had something to do with it." Chills ran down Emily's spine. So it wasn't just her imagination. There was something malevolent about the mirror, something ancient waiting to be released. "I'm sorry you had to go through this," the host murmured. "I should have warned you." Emily's voice trembled as she replied, "Get rid of it. Don't let anyone else stay there with it." She hung up, the finality of it all settling over her like a cold blanket. The villa, the mirror, the figure, they were behind her. But the terror would never leave. As they continued the journey home, Emily glanced out the window, the miles between her and the villa stretching. But the fear in her heart didn't fade. She couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was still watching, waiting. Months passed, but the nightmares never stopped. The figure's empty, knowing eyes haunted her every night. Then one evening, as Emily walked through her apartment, she froze. On the wall was a framed mirror, ornate and antique. It couldn't be the same, but for a brief moment she swore the reflection wasn't hers. It was the figure, tall, shadowy, its eyes gleaming in the dim light. And just as quickly, it vanished. Emily turned away, her breath shallow, but deep down, she knew the mirror wasn't done with her. It was only a matter of time before it would call her back.